On a warm September morning in 1977, a 29-year-old woman named Gloria Jones was driving a purple Mini along Queen's Ride in Barnes, southwest London, when the car left the road and hit a sycamore tree at a speed that left no margin for survival. What was in the passenger seat was a man who had sold 50 million records, who had put glitter on the face of an entire generation, who had been the biggest pop star in Britain for 3 years running, and who had told at least 4 separate people in the weeks before that morning that he was going to die in a car crash. His name was Marc Bolan. He was 29 years old. He had never owned a driving license in his life, because he was too frightened of cars to learn. And what followed, the tributes, the investigations, the conspiracy theories, and the decades of grief from a fan base that never entirely recovered, is one of the strangest and most haunting stories rock and roll has ever produced. Welcome to the life and tragedy of Marc Bolan. Part 1. The Boy Who Invented Himself. Marc Feld arrived in the world on September 30th, 1947, in Hackney, East London, the second son of Simeon Feld, a lorry driver of Jewish descent, and Phyllis Winifred Atkins, a stallholder at Berwick Street Market in Soho, who sold second-hand clothes with a commercial instinct her son would inherit completely. The family lived in a prefabricated council house in Stoke Newington, one of the thousands of temporary structures thrown up across bombed-out London after the war. And the neighborhood was the kind of place that measured its ambitions carefully against its means. Most people who grew up in those streets did not imagine themselves anywhere else. Marc Feld, almost from the moment he was old enough to articulate a thought, imagined himself everywhere else. He was a beautiful child. This is not incidental. The beauty was the first instrument he learned to play, and he played it with a precision that adults around him found disconcerting. He was vain in the specific way of someone who understands from an early age that their appearance is a resource, not merely a fact. He spent hours in front of mirrors. He experimented with his mother's clothes. He studied the way light fell on his face and adjusted accordingly. His older brother Harry, a more conventionally directed child, watched all of this with a mixture of bewilderment and pride. What Phyllis Feld had passed on to her younger son, without either of them fully understanding it at the time, was a salesman's instinct. She knew how to make something look more valuable than it was. She knew how to position a thing so that people wanted it. Marc absorbed this at close range for the first decade of his life, and when he eventually transferred the skill from market stalls to music, he would deploy it with an effectiveness that reshaped British popular culture. His school years at Northwold Primary, and then William Wordsworth Secondary, Modern, were not distinguished academically, but were notable for the intensity of his social performance. He was not a bully, and not a victim. He was a performer, constantly, in every context. Teachers remembered him less for any specific talent than for the quality of his presence, a sense that the room arranged itself slightly differently when he was in it. He left school at 15 with no qualifications and no plan beyond a certainty. Stated to his mother with complete conviction that he was going to be famous. The route to that fame began not with music but with modeling. At 15, Marc Feld appeared in Town magazine, one of the leading style publications of early 1960s Britain. As a representative of the mod subculture that was reshaping working-class youth culture from the inside out, the photograph showed a boy in a sharp suit, with a face that the camera loved, in the specific way that some faces are simply made for the lens. Not pretty exactly, not handsome in any conventional sense, but arresting. You could not look at the photograph and then look away easily. Something in the face refused to be dismissed. The mod scene gave Marc Feld his first community, and his first understanding of how style operated as identity. The mods were working-class kids, who had decided that clothes and music and attitude could constitute a complete alternative to the life the economy had planned for them. They dressed with a meticulousness that was almost aggressive. They listened to American soul and R&B with a devotion that bordered on religious. They spent money they didn't really have on things that were, by any reasonable measure, unnecessary. And in doing so, they created one of the most distinctive youth movements Britain had ever produced. Marc was a mod of the most committed variety. He saved money from various odd jobs to buy clothes from the boutiques on Carnaby Street and the King's Road. He spent Saturday afternoons at the Scene Club in Ham Yard, Soho, and the Flamingo on Wardour Street, absorbing the music and the atmosphere and watching the way the most admired figures in the scene carried themselves. He was always studying. He just didn't look like he was. The music came in parallel. He had been given a guitar at around 9 years old, a cheap acoustic that he taught himself to play by ear. in the back bedroom of the Stoke Newington house. By his teenage years he was playing with enough confidence to perform at parties and in the back rooms of pubs. And the voice was already there in embryonic form, a high, quavering, deliberately arched sound that owed something to Eddie Cochran and something to Early Dylan and something to no one who had existed before. It was not a conventionally beautiful voice. It was a distinctive voice, which is a different and more durable quality. He changed his name around this time, informally at first, and then permanently. Markfeld became Marc Bolan, a compressed version of Bob Dylan that he deployed, with the shamelessness of someone who understood that the reference was the point. He was announcing his influences and his ambitions simultaneously. He was not hiding where he wanted to go. In 1965, at 17, he briefly joined a band called John's Children, a mod outfit with a reputation for spectacular stage chaos that included throwing lumps of wood into the audience and creating enough noise to get themselves thrown off a support slot on a hoot tour. Mark was not with them for long. He was absorbing experience rather than committing to it. Every band, every scene, every encounter was material. The real turning point came in 1967, when Mark met Steve Peregrine. Took Part 2. The Wizard, the Elf, and the Dream. Steve Peregrine took born Stephen Ross Porter in Eltham, southeast London. In 1949 was a percussionist and multi-instrumentalist whose musical instincts ran toward the strange and the folkloric. He was 2 years younger than Mark, and in almost every respect his opposite. Chaotic where Mark was controlled, communally minded where Mark was fiercely individual, generous with credit where Mark was constitutionally incapable of sharing the spotlight. What they had in common was a shared obsession with a particular strain of English mysticism, the folklore and fairy tale tradition, the pre-industrial landscape of myth and magic, and the peculiarly English romantic tradition that ran from William Blake through J.R.R. Tolkien to the underground psychedelia of the late 1960s. Together they formed Tyrannosaurus Rex, a name drawn from the prehistoric past, and perfectly calibrated to suggest both power and extinction. The band was, in its original incarnation, deliberately anti-commercial, a two-piece acoustic act that played on the floor of small venues, surrounded by candles and incense, to audiences who sat cross-legged and listened with the devoted attention of people at a ritual rather than a concert. Mark played acoustic guitar and sang. Took played bongos and various percussion instruments, and contributed backing vocals. The music they made was delicate, peculiar, and entirely unlike anything else happening in British rock at the time. Their champion was John Peel, the BBC Radio 1 disc jockey who was, in the late 1960s, the single most important arbiter of credibility in British underground music. Peel heard Tyrannosaurus Rex, and responded with an enthusiasm that was not simply professional. He genuinely loved them. He played their records incessantly on his late-night program Top Gear and Perfumed Garden, and his audience, a devoted community of serious music listeners who trusted his taste implicitly, followed him there. Between 1968 and 1969, Tyrannosaurus Rex released 3 albums. My People Were Fair and Had Sky in Their Hair, but now they recontent to wear stars on their brows, prophets, seers, and sages, the angels of the ages. An unicorn that sold modestly, but established Mark as a figure of genuine, underground credibility. The albums were full of the imagery that would become his signature. Elves and wizards, cosmic battles, ancient forests, creatures of myth doing things that creatures of myth do. The lyrics were sometimes barely coherent and occasionally quite beautiful, and the voice that delivered them was unlike anything on British radio, thin and trembling, and shot through with an earnestness that managed simultaneously to be completely sincere and slightly absurd. This combination, the earnestness, the absurdity, the beauty, the strangeness, was Marc Bolan's first and most authentic artistic identity. It would not be the identity that made him famous. That identity required a different set of ingredients entirely. But the underground years were not simply a prelude. They were the foundation, the place where Mark learned what he was capable of making and what he was not yet capable of making, and the place where he developed the discipline and the aesthetic confidence that the commercial years would draw upon. The partnership with Took ended badly in 1969. Took's drug use had become problematic. His behavior on tours increasingly unpredictable, and Mark, who was not a man who shared control easily, decided the partnership was over. You replaced took with Mickey Finn, a handsome percussionist from Thornton Heath who was a far more manageable presence, and whose primary function, it must be said honestly, was to look good standing next to Marc rather than to shape the music in any fundamental way. And then, in 1970, everything changed. Part 3. The Night Britain Lost Its Mind. The story of how Marc Bolan went from underground acoustic troubadour to the biggest pop star in Britain is one of those transformations that looks, in retrospect, inevitable and was, at the time, almost completely unexpected. The pivot began in late 1970 with a single called Ride a White Swan, released in October of that year. The record was still credited to Tyrannosaurus Rex, but something fundamental had shifted. Marc had plugged in his guitar. He had added a drummer, Bill Legend, and a bassist, Steve Curry, and he had distilled everything he had learned about hooks and rhythm and the specific frequency at which pop music enters the body and refuses to leave into 2 minutes and 21 seconds of music that was simultaneously completely new and somehow deeply familiar, as though it had always existed and had simply been waiting to be found. Ride a White Swan reached number 2 on the UK singles chart. It was the highest chart position Marc had ever achieved, and it arrived at a moment when British pop music was badly in need of something it couldn't quite name. The late 1960s counterculture had burned itself out, the Beatles had broken up, the music that had defined the decade was retreating into either heavy rock seriousness or saccharine pop blandness, and neither direction was producing anything that felt vital or alive. Marc Bolan, with his electric guitar and his glitter and his curly hair and his cheekbones that looked like they had been designed by someone with a strong point of view, arrived into that vacuum like a match into dry paper. The band was renamed T-Rex. The name itself was a compression, a trimming away of everything unnecessary, which was exactly what the music was doing. Where Tyrannosaurus Rex had been dense and folkloric and deliberately difficult, T-Rex was direct and physical and immediately pleasurable. The riffs were simple. The lyrics were nonsense of a very particular and calculated kind, words chosen for sound rather than meaning, for the way they felt in the mouth and on the ear. Hot Love, Bang a Gong, Metal Guru, Cosmic Dancer. They were not poetry, they were incantation. Hot Love, released in March 1971, spent 6 weeks at number 1 in the United Kingdom. Get It On, released in July 1971, spent 4 weeks at number 1. Jeepster, released in November 1971, reached number 2. And then, in January 1972, Telegram Sam spent 3 weeks at number 1. Followed in May by Metal Guru, which spent 4 weeks at number 1. Marc Bolan had 5 number 1 singles in the space of roughly 14 months. He was, by any objective measurement, the biggest pop star in Britain. The album, Electric Warrior, released in September 1971, was the record that crystallized everything T-Rex had become. It was produced by Tony Visconti, who would remain Marc's primary collaborator for the rest of his career. And it had a sound that was simultaneously primitive and sophisticated, built on simple blues structures, but given a sheen and a warmth by Visconti's production that made it feel like the most natural music in the world. It debuted at number 1 in the UK. It sold millions of copies. It was the soundtrack to a cultural moment that the British press had by this point given a name. Rextasy. Rextasy was real. It was not a press invention or a marketing construct. It was the actual, documented, photographed and filmed phenomenon of thousands of young people, primarily girls, primarily between the ages of 12 and 16, losing their minds at the sight and sound of Marc Bolan in a way that had not been seen in Britain since Beatlemania. Girls screamed until they fainted. They pushed through police barriers. They threw themselves at stage doors and hotel entrances and tour buses. They wept in a way that was not entirely about Marc Bolan, and was entirely about Marc Bolan simultaneously. That strange displacement of adolescent feeling onto a face, and a sound that becomes, for a time, the container of everything unbearable and wonderful about being young. Marc was 24 years old at the peak of Rextasy. He had been working toward this moment, in one form or another, since he was 15. He had earned it through a decade of work and reinvention, and the kind of focused ambition that most people never sustain for more than a year or two. And he was, by every account of those around him during this period, intoxicated by it in a way that was both completely understandable and the beginning of his undoing. He had a girlfriend, June Child, who had been with him since the underground years, and who had managed his affairs with a practicality and devotion that had helped build the platform on which T-Rex now stood. He moved her aside in 1971 for a woman named Gloria Jones, an American soul singer from Cincinnati who had written and originally recorded Tainted Love, the song that Soft Cell would make famous a decade later. Gloria was talented, warm, and deeply in love with Marc. Marc was deeply in love with Marc. And with Gloria, in roughly that order, which was the honest shape of how he organized his affections. The Slider, released in July 1972, confirmed that Electric Warrior had not been an accident. It was another #1 album, another collection of hits, another chapter in the T-Rex story that seemed, from inside it, like it might go on indefinitely. It did not go on indefinitely, nothing like Rextasy ever does. Part 4. The cracks behind the glitter. The decline of T-Rex as a commercial force did not happen overnight, and it did not happen for a single reason. It happened the way most declines happen, gradually, from multiple directions simultaneously. Each individual problem manageable in isolation, and collectively fatal. The first problem was America. Marc had conquered Britain with a speed and totality that very few artists achieve, and the natural next step was to repeat the conquest in the United States, where the real money was, and where the truly global careers were made. He tried. T-Rex toured America extensively in 1971 and 1972, and the results were, by any reasonable assessment, disappointing. Get It On retitled Bang a Gong for the American Market, to avoid confusion with a John Lennon song, reached number 10 on the Billboard Hot 100, which was respectable. But the mass hysteria, the screaming girls, the #1 albums, the cultural dominance that defined the T-Rex experience in Britain simply did not transfer across the Atlantic. The reasons were partly cultural. American rock audiences in the early 1970s were in a serious-minded phase, interested in the elaborate musicianship of progressive rock and the studied authenticity of the singer-songwriter movement. What Marc was offering: glitter, simplicity, physical pleasure, deliberate silliness, was not what American rock credibility looked like in 1972. He was too pop for the rock audience, and too rocked for the pop audience, and the middle ground he occupied so completely in Britain had no American equivalent. The failure to break America wounded Marc more than he showed, and the way he responded to it was the second problem. He began to overproduce. Where Electric Warrior and the Slider had been built on a philosophy of restraint, keep the riff simple, keep the arrangement minimal, let the song breathe. Tanks, released in March 1973, added strings and orchestration, and a complexity that served neither the music nor the audience. It reached number 4 in the UK, which was still a very respectable chart position, but it felt, to the fans who had been there from the beginning, like the first step in a wrong direction. The third problem was Bowie. David Bowie had been a friend of Marc since the late 1960s, a fellow traveler in the South London music scene who had watched Marc's rise with an attention that was partly admiring and partly strategic. When Ziggy Stardust arrived in 1972, it was immediately and inevitably compared to T-Rex, and not entirely unfavorably to Bowie, where Marc had pioneered the glam rock aesthetic, the glitter, the androgyny, the theatrical self-presentation. Bowie had taken it to a conceptual and artistic level that Marc had not reached. Ziggy Stardust was a character, a concept, a fully realized artistic statement. T-Rex was a feeling, a riff, a face. Both were valid. But Bowie's approach had more intellectual longevity. And as 1972 became 1973, the critical consensus began to shift in a way that Marc felt acutely. He and Bowie maintained a complicated friendship throughout this period, the kind of friendship between competitive people, where the competition is never quite acknowledged and never quite absent. Marc spoke warmly of David in public. In private, the comparisons aided him. He was not, by temperament, a man who could observe someone else occupying the space he had defined without feeling that a theft had occurred. The fourth problem was drugs and alcohol. Marc had always enjoyed both, but through the peak years, the enjoyment had been recreational rather than consuming. By 1973 and 1974, the balance was shifting. He was drinking more heavily. His cocaine use, which had been casual, was becoming habitual. The physical consequences were visible to those around him, and eventually to the public. Marc had been famously slight throughout his career. The elfin figure on stage, whose physical delicacy was part of his mythology. By 1974 he was gaining weight, and in the specific cruelty of the pop world, this was treated as news. The tabloid press, which had celebrated him without reservation 3 years earlier, began to print photographs with captions that were not kind. Zinc Alloy and the Hidden Riders of Tomorrow, released in February 1974, was the record that confirmed what the insiders already knew. It was unfocused, overlong, and lyrically self-indulgent, in a way that the early T-Rex records had never been. It reached number 12 in the UK. 12 was not a disaster for most bands. For a band that had put 5 singles to number 1 in 14 months, 12 was a statement. The singles were still charting. The audience was still there. Loyal and devoted in the way that the audiences of fallen stars often are. More fiercely attached in decline than they had ever been at the peak. But the cultural moment had passed, and everyone could feel it, including Marc. The question was what he was going to do about it. Part 5. 3 years in the wilderness. The years between 1974 and 1977 were, by any honest accounting, the wilderness years of Marc Bolan's career. They were not without activity. He recorded prolifically, toured when he could, and produced music that, in its best moments, showed that the instincts which had created Electric Warrior were still present and still capable of generating something worth hearing. But the commercial results were uniformly disappointing, and the personal circumstances were, for extended periods, genuinely chaotic. Marc and Gloria Jones had a son in September 1975. They named him Roland Bolan, a characteristically Bolan-esque piece of wordplay that managed to be both narcissistic and charming in equal measure. Marc was, by multiple accounts, a devoted and affectionate father, and the arrival of Roland gave him a stability of purpose that the career was no longer providing. He spoke about his son with an openness and warmth that surprised people who had known him primarily as a creature of vanity and self-promotion. Fatherhood reached something in him that fame had not. The professional situation, meanwhile, was deteriorating in ways that required practical attention. His management structure had become dysfunctional. His record label relationships were strained. The T-Rex brand, which had been one of the most valuable properties in British pop, was worth considerably less than it had been 3 years earlier, and the infrastructure around him reflected that devaluation. Some of the people who had been instrumental in building his career during the peak years had moved on to other clients. Some had been pushed out by Marc himself, whose tendency to centralize control was a structural flaw in his professional life that the success years had masked and the decline years exposed. He relocated to America for a period, living in Los Angeles with Gloria and the young Roland, and the American sojourn was a mixed experience. He was not famous in America in the way he was famous in Britain, which was both a relief and a humiliation. The anonymity allowed him to move through the city without the attention that had defined his British life for 5 years. And he found, to his surprise, that he didn't entirely miss it. He was writing, he was reading, he was spending time with his son. He was, in a reduced and quieter way, living a life. But he was also drinking. And the drinking, in Los Angeles, away from the professional structures and social obligations that had given his days shape in London, became heavier than it had been, even at the nadir of the commercial years. People who spent time with him in Los Angeles during this period described a man who was capable of extraordinary charm and intellectual engagement, and who could, within the same afternoon, drink himself into a state of incoherence that alarmed everyone around him. He returned to Britain in 1976 with the specific intention of rebuilding. The punk revolution had arrived in his absence, and the landscape it had created was, for Marc, a complicated opportunity. On one hand, punk had demolished the progressive rock pomposity that had been one of the factors in T-Rex's commercial decline. On the other hand, punk had also demolished the glam rock era that Marc had pioneered, treating it as part of the bloated establishment against which the new movement defined itself. Marc navigated this with more intelligence than most of his contemporaries. He was quick to align himself publicly with the punk movement, attending Sex Pistols gigs, speaking warmly of the energy and the anger, presenting himself not as a relic of the old order, but as a forerunner of the new one. There was genuine truth in the claim. The Ramones had cited T-Rex as an influence. The Damned covered Get It On. The connection between Marc's stripped-down, riff-based approach and the punk ethos was not merely rhetorical. It was musical. In 1977, he was given his own television show. Marc, broadcast on Granada Television, was a 6-episode series that gave him a weekly platform and placed him in direct contact with the punk generation he was courting. The guests on the show included Generation X, Eddie and the Hot Rods, and, most memorably, The Jam. And in the final episode, filmed but never broadcast in Marc's lifetime, his old friend David Bowie appeared as a guest. The two men together on screen for the first time in years, a reunion that felt, to those who watched it, like the closing of a circle. The television show was a genuine success. It reminded a generation of viewers why Marc Bolan had mattered, and it introduced him to a younger audience that had been too young for Rextasy, but was old enough now to understand what it had been. He was losing weight. He had largely stopped drinking. A single dandy in the underworld, released in February 1977, reached number 26 in the UK charts, which was modest but represented the first sign of commercial recovery in 3 years. By the summer of 1977, Marc Bolan was, for the first time in years, genuinely optimistic about his career. He was sober, or close to it. He was writing with focus and energy. He had a television audience. He had a new album in progress. He was 30 years old, which was not old. And he had enough talent, and enough instinct, and enough understanding of how pop music worked, to know. Part 6. The Premonition. This is the part of the story that resists comfortable explanation, and it deserves to be told, without embellishment, but also without dismissal. Because the documented record of what Marc Bolan said in the weeks before his death is too consistent and too specific to be treated simply as coincidence. The fear of cars was not new. Marc had been frightened of cars and of dying in a car crash for most of his adult life. He had never learned to drive, which was unusual for a man of his generation and means, but was, in Marc's own explanation, a direct consequence of his conviction that he would die in a car if he got behind the wheel. He was always a passenger. He always sat in the back. He was not casual about this fear. It was a rule. In the summer of 1977, the rule relaxed slightly. Gloria drove. Marc sat in the passenger seat. It was an accommodation to the practical demands of their life together. And it represented a lowering of the guard that, in retrospect, the people around him read as significant. He told his friend, the music journalist and author Keith Altham, in the weeks before his death, that he had a premonition he was going to die in a car crash before he reached 30. He stated it plainly, without drama, in the way that people sometimes state the things they most fear, drained of emotion through repetition. Altham took it seriously enough to remember it precisely. He told a similar thing to Tony Visconti, his producer and one of his closest friends, who has spoken about it in interviews given since Marc's death with a consistency and specificity that rules out the possibility of memory shaped by hindsight. Marc was worried about dying in a car, Visconti has said. He talked about it in a way that was not quite like talking about an ordinary worry. He said it to Gloria. He said it to people at the television studio. He said it to his mother, Phyllis, who had moved to a house nearby and who saw him regularly in the final weeks of his life. He was not, in these conversations, melodramatic. He was not performing grief or seeking sympathy. He was stating, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a weather forecast, that he believed a specific thing was going to happen. Whether this constitutes a genuine premonition in any metaphysical sense is a question this script is not equipped to answer. What can be said is that it was real as a psychological event, that Marc Bolan believed it with sufficient conviction to articulate it repeatedly to people he trusted, and that the belief itself suggests a man who, in the final weeks of his life, was carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the professional recovery that was otherwise going so well. His final weeks were, by the account of those who spent them with him, genuinely happy in many respects. He and Gloria were close. Roland was 2 years old, and at the stage of development that fathers of young children find endlessly absorbing. The television show had been well received. There were plans and projects and reasons to look forward to things. He celebrated his 30th birthday on September 30th, 1977. He had a party. Friends came. David Bowie sent a message. Marc was photographed at the party looking healthy and relaxed, the thinnest he had been in years, dressed with the careful attention to appearance that had never left him regardless of what else was happening in his life. He was 30 years old. He had been afraid of not reaching 30. He had reached it. He had 16 days left. Part 7. The Tree on Queen's Ride. In the early hours of September 16, 1977, Marc Bolan and Gloria Jones attended a late dinner at a restaurant in Mayfair. They were with friends. The evening was relaxed, and by the time they left, it was past 2 a.m. Gloria was driving. Marc was in the passenger seat. The route from Mayfair to their home in Richmond took them through southwest London, across Putney Bridge and along the south bank of the Thames. It was a route Gloria knew, a route they had driven before, a route that at 2 a.m. carried almost no traffic. At the junction of Queen's Ride and Gypsy Lane in Barnes, the Mini crossed the road and hit a steel safety fence before mounting the pavement and striking the sycamore tree that had stood at the side of that road for decades, and that stands there still, marked now with a small plaque, and the accumulated tributes of 40 years of fans who make the pilgrimage to leave flowers and photographs and handwritten notes. Marc Bolan was killed on impact. He was not wearing a seatbelt. The tree struck the passenger side of the car with a force that the vehicle's small frame could not absorb, and the injuries he sustained were not survivable. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Gloria Jones survived. She was badly injured. She broke her jaw, sustained facial injuries, and spent weeks in hospital, recovering from the physical trauma of the crash. The psychological trauma, the knowledge that she had been driving the car in which the man she loved had died, was the kind of wound that does not have a recovery timeline. The police investigation into the crash found no evidence of mechanical failure in the vehicle, no evidence of excessive speed, and no other vehicles involved. The official conclusion was that the car had left the road due to a combination of the road's camber and driver error. Gloria was not charged with any offense. The investigation, by the standards of the time, was thorough enough, and the conclusions it reached were straightforward. The conspiracy theories came later, as conspiracy theories always do when a famous person dies young and suddenly. They centered primarily on 2 claims: that the crash had been engineered, and that Marc had survived the initial impact, but had been left to die while help was delayed. Neither claim has ever been substantiated by any credible evidence. The official account, a tragic accident on a quiet road in the early hours of the morning, remains the most likely explanation for what happened on Queen's Ride. What is not in dispute is the sycamore tree. It is still there. It is visited every year by people who were teenagers in 1977, and by people who were born after. Marc Bolan died and found his music, and felt in it something that reached them in the same way it reached the teenagers in 1972. The tree has become, in the specific way that the sites of rock tragedies become, a place where grief and love and the strange human need to mark the places where things ended take physical form. Part 8. The comeback nobody got to see. To understand what was lost when Marc Bolan died on Queen's Ride, it is necessary to understand what he was in the middle of doing. The narrative around his death has always leaned toward the elegiac, a faded star, a glory that had passed, a career that was already effectively over. This narrative is wrong in several important respects, and it does Marc a disservice that he has been carrying for 4 decades. By September 1977, Marc Bolan was in the middle of a genuine creative and commercial recovery. The television show had given him a platform and a new audience. He was sober. He was writing well. He had a new album in progress that Tony Visconti, who had produced Electric Warrior and The Slider and who was not a man given to easy praise, later described as the best work Marc had done since the peak years. The new material had a directness and a confidence that the wilderness years had lacked, and it had something else. A connection to what was happening in British music in 1977 that the earlier comeback attempts had missed. Marc understood punk not as a threat, but as a correction. And he was in the process of absorbing that correction into his music in a way that was neither sycophantic nor forced. He had always been at his best when he was simplifying, stripping away, reducing things to their essential riff and rhythm and voice. Punk was telling him to do exactly that, and he was listening. The album that was left unfinished at his death was eventually released posthumously as Dandy in the Underworld, which had been recorded before the crash and released in February 1977. The material, recorded in the final months of his life, the sessions that Visconti described so warmly, was never completed. It exists in fragments and rough mixes, scattered across tapes that have been in the care of Marc's estate for decades, heard by a small number of people, and described by those people in terms that make its loss genuinely significant. There was also the television series, the final episode, featuring David Bowie, had been filmed but not yet broadcast. Marc did not live to see it air. It was eventually broadcast in 1977 after his death, and the footage of the two friends performing together has since become one of the most watched and most discussed documents of that era. A record of a friendship and a rivalry and a mutual respect that the deaths of both men, Bowie died in January 2016, have rendered permanently incomplete. What he would have done next is not knowable. Predictions about what artists would have created had they lived are always speculative, and usually too generous, shaped by grief rather than by honest assessment. But the evidence of the final year of Marc's life suggests strongly that he was not a man in terminal decline. He was a man in the middle of a comeback. The crash did not end a career that was already over. It ended a career that was, after several difficult years, beginning again. Part 9. What the Tree Could Not Take. Marc Bolan has been dead for longer than he was alive. He was 29 years and 17 days old when the sycamore tree on Queensrÿde ended his life. He has now been gone for nearly half a century. And the question of what he left behind, and what it means, and why it still matters, is one that his music answers more eloquently than any biographical account can. The T-Rex catalog, Electric Warrior, The Slider, the singles from 1970 to 1973, has never gone out of print and has never stopped finding new listeners. The songs are not nostalgic artifacts, not primarily, though they carry the specific weight of their era in the way that all great pop music does. They are alive in the present tense. Get It On still sounds like the best possible version of a certain kind of feeling. Cosmic Dancer still sounds like the inside of an adolescent mind rendered in music. Children of the Revolution still sounds like it was written last week. His influence on what came after him is both direct and atmospheric. The punk bands who claimed him as a forerunner were not wrong. The glam revival of the 1980s, from the New Romantics through to the harder end of the glam metal scene, drew directly on the T-Rex template. Morrissey, who was a teenager at the peak of Rextasy, and who was photographed outside the sycamore tree on Queensrÿde in the weeks after Marc's death, has cited him as a formative influence of the most fundamental kind. Prince, who shared Marc's gift for combining sexuality and whimsy, and the physical pleasure of a great riff, acknowledged a debt. The list of artists who point back to Marc Bolan as a root system is long, and varied enough to constitute an argument about his centrality to everything that came after. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as part of T-Rex in 2020, 43 years after his death. The induction was deserved and absurdly late, and it prompted the usual conversation about why it had taken so long. A conversation that tends to dissolve into the same conclusion it always reaches. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has a complicated relationship with British artists from outside the canonical tradition, and Marc Bolan, who is not quite rock and not quite pop and not quite anything that fit a pre-existing category, paid the price for that complication for 4 decades. His son Roland, who was 2 years old when his father died, and who has spent his adult life as both the keeper of his father's legacy and as a musician in his own right, has spoken movingly in interviews about what it means to be the child of someone who died before you were old enough to know them, and who you have had to reconstruct from records and photographs and the accounts of people who loved him. It is a particular kind of grief, Roland has said. The grief for someone you never quite had, which means the loss never quite has a bottom. Gloria Jones, who survived the crash that killed Marc, eventually recovered from her physical injuries and returned to her music career. She has spoken about Marc in interviews over the years, with a love and a grief that the passage of time has not diminished. She has also, with great dignity, declined to accept the blame that some corners of the fan base directed at her in the years after the crash, a blame that was always unjust, and that she has carried with a grace that says more about her character than her detractors. Phyllis Feld, Marc's mother, who had sold second-hand clothes on Baruch Street Market and had watched her beautiful son become the biggest pop star in Britain, and had then watched him decline, and then had watched him recover, and had then received the phone call that no mother should receive, lived until 1998. She spent the last 20 years of her life as the primary custodian of her son's memory, and she did it with the same practical intelligence and commercial instinct that she had passed on to him in the first place. The sycamore tree on Queensrÿde in Barnes has become, over the decades, one of the most visited sites of rock and roll pilgrimage in Britain. The local council has, at various points, proposed cutting it down on safety grounds. And at every such proposal the response from the public has been immediate and overwhelming enough to halt the plan. The tree is not going anywhere. It has become, improbable as this is, a monument, a specific and accidental marker of a specific and accidental ending. People bring flowers. People bring photographs. People bring handwritten notes that speak to the man inside the myth, the boy from Hackney who changed his name and taught himself to be extraordinary, and was afraid of cars, and died in one anyway, at 29, on a quiet road in southwest London, before the album was finished. Coda. There was a photograph taken on September 30th, 1977, at Marc Bolan's 30th birthday party. He is standing in a group of friends, holding a glass, wearing something characteristically extraordinary. And he is smiling with the specific quality of smile that belongs to people who have survived something they were not sure they would survive. He had been afraid of not reaching 30. He had reached 30. He looks, in the photograph, like a man who has exhaled. He had 16 days left. The career that Marc Bolan built, and then half destroyed, and then began to rebuild, was never as simple as the mythology around it suggests. He was not simply a glam rock icon who burned brightly and faded. He was a serious and disciplined craftsman who spent a decade learning his trade before the world noticed him, and who spent the years after his commercial peak searching, with varying success, for the way back to the thing that had made him extraordinary. He found it, in the end, the television show, the new music, the reconnection with the energy of the street. He was on his way back. The comeback was not hypothetical. It was happening. The sycamore tree was not in the plan. Marc Bolan understood. From his earliest years in the Stoke Newington prefab, where his mother sold him the idea that appearance was power, that the distance between obscurity and stardom was not talent but presentation, he presented himself with a genius for self-invention that has rarely been equaled in British pop. He put glitter on his cheekbones and plugged in his guitar, and reinvented himself so completely that the person who made Electric Warrior bore almost no surface resemblance to the person who had sat cross-legged on the floor of a small London venue playing acoustic guitar to a handful of serious-faced John Peel listeners 3 years earlier. What did not change, through all the reinventions, was the instinct. The instinct for the riff that enters the body and refuses to leave. The instinct for the lyric that means nothing and means everything. The instinct for the moment in a pop song where everything drops away except the feeling. He had that instinct at 15, sitting in front of a mirror in Hackney, learning to make himself look like someone worth watching. He had it at 29, in a recording studio in London, making music that his producer would later say was the best work of his career. The tree took the man. It did not take the music. The music is still there, exactly where he left it.